Hi, everyone. Welcome to the wonderful world of Remnant Radio. Today, we're talking about the King James Bible and all therein. It's going to be an exciting episode. You guys stay tuned.
That was smooth.
I think you like
King
that.
Jamesy.
Yeah.
You are watching the Remnant Radio, a crowd-funded show where we interview pastors, teachers, historians, and theologians from different churches and denominations. My name is Joshua Lewis, and this is my co-host, Michael Roundtree. Together, we want to help you break outside of your theological echo chambers. If you're interested in learning about history, theology, or the gifts of the Spirit, this is the show for you.
Today, I'm very, very excited. We have Mark Ward on the other line with us. He's joining with us today to discuss the King James Bible. Before we dialogue about the contents of the King James Bible and introduce our guest, I want to remind you guys that we're an entirely crowd-funded ministry by putting you on my camera and not Michael's. We're an entirely crowd-funded ministry. If you've been blessed by the videos that we have produced, consider giving in the links of the descriptions. You can give on PayPal or Patreon. PayPal, you can give a one-time gift of any amount, or Patreon, you can give as low as $5 a month, get extra content, and help support us. We're actually going to fly out to Kentucky tomorrow. Me and Michael, tomorrow night, we're going to fly out to Kentucky and we're going to spend, like 8 hours with Craig Keener filming on the Gospel of Mark.
Yeah, man.
So if you're out there and you're like, hey, we want to support that, it costs a lot of money to do that. And we're not making any money from doing it. We're just the generosity of our heart. If you want to help support the ministry, that would be great. Michael, you excited about today?
And Craig Keener will be on the show, we think, on Wednesday.
Probably.
For the to-be-continued episode, talking about the gifts of the Holy Spirit. And tomorrow, we are starting something brand new, a series. It'll be 12 weeks long on the Church Fathers, and so that'll be tomorrow starting at 4 p.m. We have Father Ron Drummond from the Anglican tradition. Matthew Esquivel is going to be on the show, as well as Josh Hoffert. And so all of them have been on the show a number of times, and just they live and breathe church history. And it's our first show where
our ugly mugs aren't on it.
We're not on it, so they're going to be on it.
We're helping other creators' content. Yeah.
It's going to be really exciting. Talking for the first episode, Augustine and Pelagius. That'll be tomorrow. So make sure you guys hit that subscribe button, and that way you can be in touch with some of the episodes that we're putting out.
And without further ado, I'd love to introduce you to Mark. Mark, tell us about yourself and your ministry before we dive into the subject.
I'm standing in the offices of Faith Life right now in Bellingham, Washington. Faith Life is the parent company that makes Logos Bible software, and my particular role here has changed over time. I've been a Logos Pro, helping people learn how to use the software by writing articles about Bible study and theology. I've been an academic editor at Lexham Press, working on Logos platform projects like the Lexham Survey of Theology, and now I am the editor of Bible Study Magazine, have been for about the past year, goes out to about 100,000 people. We're trying to invite people into the kind of Bible study that Logos facilitates, which is responsible Bible study using responsible resources, academic Bible study, using Greek and Hebrew, even at the lay level. I'm an assistant pastor at my church, Cornerstone Baptist, in Anacortes, Washington. I have a wife who is the proprietress of Blackburn Gardens, blackburngardens.com, a micro-urban flower farm. And I've got 3 homeschooled children who are probably bouncing off the walls at this very moment.
Wow,
Dang,
he slaughtered that intro. I was like, I told him, get it all out. And he was like, are you reading a script there, bro? You just, okay. That was awesome.
Well, yeah, and you
This
do a
isn't
lot,
my
man.
first interview.
you do a lot. I hope to achieve, like, by age 80, what you have done by whatever your age is. So.
Yeah, and honestly, guys, if you haven't checked out his stuff, go onto YouTube. Google his name, Mark Ward. You're going to find phenomenal content. And bro, I just want to encourage you, keep up the hard work on YouTube, because your stuff is going to blow up for sure, because it is compact. You're not going to be scrubbing the video trying to find useful information. It's so compact. It's so tightly put together and well researched. You guys will be super edified. So go check out that content there on YouTube. Can we just start off and introduce us to the King James Bible? What is it? Where did it come from? Why have you written a book on it?
Well, let me start with the last question. I wrote this book, Authorized: The Use and Misuse of the King James Bible, Lexham Press, 2018, because I love the Bible, and I want the plowboy to have it in his English. And my backstory includes about 4 years, depending on how you count, within King James onlyism. I had a good experience. I was not spiritually abused. I was taught well in their Christian school. I actually learned Latin in 8th grade in a King James only Christian school.
Praise God.
But I was told that, in no uncertain terms, that the King James was the only trustworthy English Bible translation, possibly the only trustworthy translation at all, and that everything else was a corruption and a perversion, with the possible exception of some things that came before, though we never really got into that. The King James did have predecessors. It was actually a revision of the 1568 Bishop's Bible, and that's really important because you look at the beginning of the King James, you look in the translators to the reader preface, and you'll see an extended defense of the very thing that I am now defending on my YouTube channel. That is the necessity of revision of English Bible translations. They answer the simple questions that are put forth all the time by the King James only crowd in the church, our brothers and sisters in that world, such as, well, hey, if you're going to make a revision, does that mean that you are saying what we had before is no good? And the King James translators actually go back to Jerome, the translator of the Latin Vulgate, and say, no, that's not what we're saying. We're just trying to polish the brass a little bit more. The King James is a revision of the Bishop's Bible, which is itself, through a series of other Bible translations, really basically William Tyndale's work. But that's really true of the contemporary translations we have, too, especially those that fall directly in the King James line. Not sure I answered every one of your questions there. I think I got at least the first and last.
Oh, pretty darn close, for sure. I think that was it.
Okay. All right. And I just want to maybe invite you to introduce this topic more broadly, because you grew up, you said you were in a school that was King James only, you weren't spiritually abused, but you had some experience in this movement. For those who have had no experience in this movement, there's some people who are watching this video who are saying, this is a thing? I mean, I know people use the King James Bible,
That's right, yeah.
but like there are legitimately people who say this is the only rightful translation, and they immediately think of all these questions like, okay, well, what about before the 17th century? Like, was everybody just wrong? Like, what about Chinese speakers? Like, they just have, like, help us understand how widespread is King James onlyism?
You know, I get asked this question on a regular basis, and when I first proposed this book to Lexham Press, I thought that's what they would say to me, like, this is still a thing, why do we need to write a book on this? But the now head editor, Jesse, who's now my boss, wasn't at the time, said, yeah, I see a need for this. It does exist on at least the internet fringes. You know, if you're a Christian on social media, I'll be shocked if you don't encounter King James onlyism at some point. Lots of people, lots of Christians have questions about Bible translation, and if you pose a question like that, or one of your friends does, almost certainly a King James only brother or sister is going to post on there. I don't have figures as to how many King James only churches exist, how many King James only Christians exist in the world. I know it goes beyond the borders of the United States. I've estimated, 10,000 churches. I don't know. It goes. I just know that every time I turn around, I'm running into it. That's a lot because I've chosen to reach out to this group. And a lot of that is because I had a positive experience. I was taught faithfulness to God's word, an earnestness about evangelism, a desire for personal holiness, all good things that I still absolutely hold as essential to my life as a Christian. And I see my King James only brothers in the mainstream of the movement as being inconsistent with the good things that they taught me. At the extremes, it does get pretty crazy, and they won't have answers to your simple questions. What about Chinese? What about, before 1611? Or you'll get very confused answers. There are a group of extremists, mainly followers of Peter Ruckman and of Gail Ripplinger and some other, and look how fat this book is. It's called New Age Bible Versions, an exhaustive documentation exposing the message men and manuscripts moving mankind to the Antichrist one world religion. The new case against the NIV, ESV, New King James, NASB, HCSB, NRSV, NAB, NAT, et cetera, and all modern versions. The latest research supporting the authorized King James Bible. I really cannot say anything kind about this. I cannot be gracious and charitable. It is all claptrap. This is total extremism. She'll say, and Peter Ruckman would say, the King James is itself revelation from God, correcting the Greek and the Hebrew. We've got all these, variants in the manuscripts, but the King James will tell us. That's the extreme. I was in the mainstream where they'll say, no, it's the Textus Receptus, the Greek New Testament edition on which the King James is based, and the Masoretic text, those are what are perfect. Every jot and tittle, Jesus said, would remain until all is fulfilled. And we're using the one and only trustworthy translation of these perfect texts. That's the mainstream of the movement.
Okay, so there's going to be people who are listening that are like, okay, maybe they're non-Christians. They're saying these Christians are debating over which Bible to use because they think that this Bible is going to suit their preconceptions, or it's going to fit their theology neater. And other people are going to be listening to this and saying, oh, well, these Bibles are copies of copies of copies, and none of the Bibles have any truth to them. And look at how the Christians fight over which book's more accurate. Can you just speak into people who may be watching from this from a non-Christian perspective, or maybe from a Christian perspective that might be ignorant of why we're having this conversation?
Yeah, I think the angle that I use there to try to explain this phenomenon to someone who just finds it totally bewildering, I draw a parallel to, I'm sorry to have to say this to you guys, but to the top podcast that I ever went on, and I'm just still like over the moon that I ever went on it. It's not Remnant Radio. I'm really sorry. It's John McWhorter's Lexicon Valley. I'm a massive fan of John McWhorter. He's an atheist linguist at Columbia University. I've actually met and interviewed him myself.
We got beat by an atheist.
Yep.
Ouch.
I just love McWhorter. He's the best popularizer of any kind in any discipline I've ever run into. And I was on his show way back in 2017, got to interview him for my own documentary. Anyway, he and I hit it off really, really well, and at least I thought so. And he said to me, Mark, I get you. I understand what you're doing. And the reason he, an atheist who didn't care for the Bible, and I found out later had an evangelical Christian, friend growing up that alienated him, whatever, the reason he understood is that he's had a parallel mission with Shakespeare. If he says to people, you say you understand these Shakespearean plays, but I'm a linguist and I know what's going on, and I know I don't understand it all. There are a lot of dead words and false friends. Words we know we don't know, that's the dead words, and words we don't even know we don't know, that's the false friends. And you can get a lot of it, and if it's acted well, sure, that helps, it doesn't hurt. But it's really delicate to tell people, no, you don't understand. And it's even more delicate to tell people the language that you regard as sacred, whether in the case of Shakespeare, culturally sacred, or in the case of the King James, religiously sacred. People don't like to have that messed with. And they will lash back out at you. And John McWhorter has had eerily parallel responses to his calls for minor refreshes of the lexemes, the words within Shakespeare, to the reactions that I've gotten. I would think that's the best parallel. And then real quick, think of the Roman Catholic Church and the status of Latin within the Roman Catholic Church over the centuries, and the status of the Latin Vulgate over time. Think of the Messianic Jews and of Judaism more generally, where Hebrew is sacrosanct, where, when I run into a Messianic Jewish brother in Christ, and the ones I have known, I believe are my brothers in Christ, they just sprinkle a bunch of Hebrew words in there when I think it's not strictly necessary. Why do they do that? Well, I think there is an impulse in man to have a sacred, or what Samuel Johnson, the early English lexicographer, called a solemn language. And by the time of Samuel Johnson, and that would be in the 18th century, the King James had taken on that role, certainly religiously, and actually also culturally.
Okay, I'm curious, Mark, about just your journey, because you started out in King James onlyism. Now you're not there. What was the catalyst for you, and what continued to pull you out of the movement?
I don't remember knowing that I was in a movement as opposed to, other Christians. I was 14 or 15 when my pastor, who I had every reason to trust, and was a good pastor, I've always said I'm thankful for his ministry. When he told me that Westcott and Hort, who created the modern versions according to him, and it's way more complicated than that, when he told me that they were bad dudes, well, I trusted him. And I just picked up this idea, and I was kind of the spelling bee champion kind of guy. 1993 National Geography Bee, New York State finalist, 100
Nice.
of us. That's my claim to fame. I used to have the T-shirt.
I'm surprised you didn't mention that in the intro.
Yeah, sorry. Didn't want to boast about 1993.
But you found a way, man. I'm kidding.
He snuck it in there anyway.
No, I
Snuck it in there.
I snuck it in there. My wife will be impressed at least.
Nice.
Anyway, I prided myself. I was arrogant about my ability with spelling and words, and I just looked down on people who, claimed to not be able to understand the King James Version very well. So there was a mixture of my own personal arrogance that I don't blame my church for, and these factoids that turned out to be not true about Westcott and Horde and the corruptions of the modern versions. But I went off to college. I went to a Christian college, and I landed in a church that was pastored by one of my Bible teachers in the college, and he introduced me to expository preaching. We dove into Ephesians, and I used to sit on the edge of my seat, and I was a graphic design major, having no idea that I would ultimately go on to seminary. But I knew I loved this, and I wanted this. I wanted good Bible teaching. And right at that moment, in God's providence, he had unwillingly gotten involved in a controversy over Bible translation. And he's a very gracious and patient man. His name is Mark Minnick, Mount Calvary Baptist Church in Greenville, South Carolina. And as part of that, he led our church away from using the King James, and he took a long time at it, like tons of Wednesday night services. And as a maybe 18 or 19-year-old, I'm thinking, get on with it. Why are you taking so long? And then I remember the night we took the vote to allow for liberty in our church to use other translations. I think they specifically said the New American Standard and the New King James. The ESV did not exist at this point. This is 1999. And after the vote was taken and we were going to have liberty to use these other translations, but before the service was over, an older man right in front of me got up and walked out. And I saw the look on his face, and I realized this is why Pastor Minnick was so patient and slow with this. And I knew this man, this older man. He was a very faithful, like deacon kind of guy in the church, working on the church grounds. I'd worked with him before. And from then on, at least, I just had a heart for good people in the church who'd been told things that I knew were not true. And I was looking for ways to reach out to them. And the ultimate, result of that is Authorized and my YouTube channel. That's how I got into this debate, and that was my journey.
Excellent. One of the things I didn't expect to see in your book, which again I loved, was that you gave a specific attention to all the good things the King James provides and the things that we're actually going to lose by not using the King James. Would you speak to that for a moment, just so that we have a well-rounded argument? Because man, I think that you were intellectually honest in addressing those things. Because man, you brought up a lot of really great stuff in the book.
Yeah, actually, one of my good friends, Andy Naselli, we were in the same PhD program together before he went on and got a second PhD. Oh, Andy. Anyway, he said, "Are you sure you want to say all this nice stuff about the King James? Do you really mean all this?" And I really thought, because he's a good friend and I trust him, he's a really sharp thinker, and I thought, I've got to pray about this. And so I did, and I came to think, no, I really mean it all. The stuff that I say in this first chapter that we're losing as the King James ceases to be our common standard includes the cultural touchstone that the King James has been. It has been a source of illusion, even in the New York Times, like all the time you'll see "by the skin of his teeth" or "let there be light," or, plays on those words. Well, that ultimately obviously comes from the King James. I also think that when there is one common standard translation within a given, ethno-linguistic group, a nation, I think that everybody starts to learn Bible verses kind of by accident, just by osmosis. So, for example, one of my key verses that we'll talk about probably later is Elijah on Mount Carmel says, "How long halt ye between two opinions? If the Lord be God, then follow him, but if Baal, then follow him." And I thought back, there's no reason I would have ever learned that in Awana, which I went to for several years, or in any of my Christian schools, or even Bible quizzing. I just learned it from hearing it. And when you hear the same wording over and over, that helps. I think the biggest thing that we have lost and are losing, and we need to weigh these values, is the implicit trust that everybody, Christians and even non-Christians, have in the translation when you've only got one. It really is impossible to explain to everybody out there. We've got all these translations, but it's not that each group is trying to change the Bible in order to fit its theology. There's other reasons for it. This is an age of rampant agenda sniffing. You know, C.S. Lewis talked about bulverism. One Ezekiel Bulver, who saw his mother say, "You only say that because you're a man." Well, is that true of the CSB? You're only translating that way because you're a Southern Baptist, or the ESV. You're only translating that way because you're a New Calvinist and a Complementarian. No, it does not work that way. But it's really hard to explain that to people. When you've only got one and all the denominations use it, there's kind of this, again, implicit trust that, okay, well, everybody agrees this one is good. And we are losing that.
Okay. Hey, I'd love to hear and this could be like, we could just turn it over and you could probably just talk the rest of the episode on this question. But we promise we would find a way to interrupt you. But the question is, what are the primary arguments advanced in favor of King James onlyism? That's one side. And then the other side is, why are you no longer convinced by those arguments? In other words, how would you rebut those today from your current position? So we'll start with the first one, and we'll help you remember to come back to the other one. What are the primary arguments advanced?
The primary arguments from the mainstream come from Matthew 5:18, Psalm 12:6 and 7, and a smattering of other passages, especially in Psalm 119. Matthew 5:18 says, this is Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, "Not a jot or a tittle," this is the King James, of course, "will pass from the law until all is fulfilled." In my mind, that is the strongest verse in the arsenal of proof texts used by, King James onlyists, because it, I believe, can plausibly be interpreted to mean that there's going to be a perfect copy or, set of manuscripts for the Hebrew Bible. And I think it's very plausible, given our general Protestant outlook on the canon, to apply Jesus' words to the New Testament as well. So, in general, when we see 2 Timothy 3, all Scripture is given by inspiration of God, there's the King James again, we're applying that generally to the New Testament. I don't know of evangelical Protestants who question that. So I think Matthew 5:18 plausibly could be promising that we're going to have perfect manuscript copies. Psalm 12:6 and 7, to my mind, is very much less clear, I think, contextually, though it says, "The words of the Lord are pure words, purified 7 times. Thou shalt keep them, O Lord. Thou shalt preserve them from this generation forever." A lot of King James onlyists say, see, God's going to preserve the words. But if you look at the Hebrew, it's very unlikely, just barely possible, that the antecedent of them, "and thou shalt keep them," goes back to words. It's probably talking about the poor. That gets into your second question. Let's continue down the train of what's their strongest argument. I think if God did promise, you're going to have a perfect set of manuscript copies of the Hebrew Bible and a perfect set of the Greek New Testament, manuscripts of the Greek New Testament, then I would need to be looking for where that is. And I would tend to presume that whatever copies or family of manuscripts God was using the most predominantly, that would constitute his imprimatur, that this is the one. That is the essence of the mainstream King James only argument right there. And I think Matthew 5:18 is their strongest point. So getting into answering it, and I'll try to be efficient here and not make you interrupt me, though you're welcome to. I already started to answer the Psalm 12 argument. I think grammatically speaking, we're talking about a Hebrew gender agreement here between the pronoun, "thou shalt keep them," and the antecedent. There's a mismatch. I can't remember off the top of my head which one's feminine and which one's masculine. I just can't remember. But it has to point back to the poor. And contextually, that's what it's talking of. It's not saying God's going to preserve perfect manuscript copies. But when you come to Matthew 5:18, I haven't tended to want to engage this part of the argument, and we'll probably get a chance to talk about why. But you asked, and this is their strongest argument, and here's my answer. God has given us zero directive on how to find these perfect manuscript copies, if indeed that's what exists, if indeed that's what Jesus is saying. There are no two, and I'm more of a New Testament Greek guy than an Old Testament Hebrew guy, so let's stick to Greek for a second. That is where the debate most rages in the King James only debate. There are no two manuscripts of the Greek New Testament of various books of any size that are exactly the same. And if Matthew 5:18 says not a jot or a tittle, okay, a jot is a yod, that's the letter I in Greek, and a tittle, pretty much everybody seems to agree, that's the little horn. The Greek is choria, that distinguishes basically the D from the H in Hebrew. So we're talking like serifs almost here, but the tiniest distinguishing mark between letters. If not a single one of them is going to pass from the law, and if he's saying this is perfect preservation, which is what the King James Onlyists say, then I'd better see perfect preservation. I have to think that's all the jots and the tittles, no more and none omitted, and all in the right order. Like, that's the only way I can interpret that. But I see no directive from God as to how to find this, and everywhere I look, I see at least minor variation, and I think it is typically excessively minor. I've worked to prove this on my website, kjvparallelbible.org. That'll take too long to get into, but even among the Textus Receptus editions, and King James Onlyists will often say on their doctrinal statements, and I'm a collector of King James Only doctrinal statements, which is a very weird hobby to have, but they'll say, we believe in I just saw one today, actually a friend of mine is the pastor of this church, long story. The Masoretic text and the Textus Receptus are the manuscripts that we accept and use, which is a mistake anyway because they're not manuscripts, they're printed editions, but there is no the Textus Receptus. There are multiple editions of Textus Receptus.
Yeah.
I wrote an article about this for the Detroit Baptist Seminary Journal, May 2020, and showed, okay, here's all the differences, like which one's perfect. And they really stumble over that. And it's really hard to find somebody who can even follow you at that level, because I don't mean to be insulting. King James Onlyists have lots of strengths, and I am utterly sincere about that. I am truly grateful for what they taught me about holiness and evangelism and so much of my faithfulness to the Word. But very few of them can read Greek, and even fewer of them can read Hebrew. It's really difficult to even find people who can have reasonable discussions with you about these matters. I've given you a super short précis of a very large and complex debate. That's it.
Yeah,
that's great.
That's really good. Okay, I'm just curious. I'm going to ask this follow-up question because, of course, one of our most foundational principles for scriptural interpretation is how would the hearers have received this in context? And so I'm curious. Clearly, people sitting around Jesus and the Sermon on the Mount aren't thinking, Jesus is promising that sometime in a millennia and a half, perhaps, a fresh manuscript that we can finally understand will come together. In other words, there's no way that they would have understood it this way. And I'm confident that KJV only people hear this argument all the time. The argument that interpretation does not fit the context in which it would originally be received. So when you've communicated that, or when others communicate that to the KJV only crowd, what kind of responses do you get?
Honestly, and I'm not being snarky here, this is when we just go right to ad hominem. I don't hear responses to that. I get personally attacked by, plenty of YouTube commenters. I'm an apostate.
Oh, it's happening right now, buddy.
The Word of God. Right. So I would love, and I do have friends in the King James only world, and there are multiple King James only worlds. There's a very small Reformed King James only world, and that's actually where I've had some of the best conversations and the worst, because they do tend to be more likely to have some seminary education in that world, so we can track with each other on language stuff. But no, I've never heard an answer to that. Indeed, I put out my paper in May of 2020, and I was kind of aiming it at this Reformed group called Confessional Bibliology, and I have not heard a response. I've heard equivocations. So I wish I could tell you. I basically don't have an answer to that.
Okay. You mentioned your book, and this isn't something I completely understand myself in English, so I'm going to have you try to explain it to us in layman's terms when it comes to the King James, because one of the strongest cases you made for one of the reasons that we would want to use it and not lose it is because the King James protects single person pronouns single person and second person pronouns with the these and thous.
Singular and plural, like thee and thou.
Yeah. So those are somehow maintained in the King James, but aren't in English or modern English translations. Speak to that for us.
Right. Yeah, this is an extremely common argument by the King James only folks, including the very best of them. So I'm going to name a name of somebody I really respect who's only on the very border of the King James only movement, but has made this kind of argument. Joel Beakey of Reformation Heritage Books. I think he's fantastic. I think he's doing an excellent job in so many ways, but he gave 13 practical reasons for continuing to use the King James. And I interacted with those in my book because I wanted to pick the very best and most responsible and knowledgeable defenders of the King James. He's on the border because he was willing to use the New King James as well, and in his publishing ministry, it also is based on the same Hebrew and Greek texts as the King James. So I think he's more consistent there than the vast majority of King James onlyism on that important point. But he says we ought to retain the use of the King James in part because of what you just mentioned. So in Greek, obviously, second person personal pronouns, and we're talking the word you here in English, but in Greek, you distinguish between singular and plural, whereas in English, we don't. So you can say, Satan has desired to have you, that he may sift you like wheat, but I have prayed for you. You can't tell in English except through context whether that's singular or plural. And so the King James makes a distinction because in Elizabethan English, you had thee serving as singular and ye and you serving as plural. Actually, it's thee, thy, and thine. Thine is what occurs before words that start with a vowel. We don't have to go into that much detail. But if you know what you're looking for, and I didn't as a King James reader growing up, then you can distinguish plural and singular second person personal pronouns.
So as a Texan, you're boiling this down to you and y'all.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
I'm a Texan.
Y'all.
I needed y'all for this explanation. So, okay.
In fact, you can even do it as a possessive of y'alls.
Yes.
There are two
Y'alls.
apostrophes in there.
That's true.
There is a y'all Bible on the internet. Have you guys seen that? Have y'all seen
No.
I have not seen the
I
y'all
know.
Bible. It sounds timely.
There does need to be a y'all.
that? It's why we have the internet, you know?
That's
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why not?
Hey, so I'm also curious. Okay, so let's just imagine that we granted, God was promising that someday there would be a perfect version. They then do have to make the case that it is this specific 1611 King James and not some other language, because what if when we were having this conversation, I started thinking about the Spanish language where you can distinguish and you can say ustedes for you plural. And so there are other languages where you can make those kinds of distinctions. So let's imagine that there's a Spanish version of King James wherever, and somewhere in Central America, they're like, this is it. This is the number one. Like, so how do they make the claim that, our language is just better? Like, how does that claim come about?
The extremists like Peter Ruckman will say that God has clearly chosen English because it's the main language of the world. It's the medium of commerce and of scientific literature. And actually, that kind of reasoning kind of spills over into the mainstream as well. This is where it's really hard to pin people down and get answers.
Okay.
My read of it is this translation lasted a long time and built up a lot of trust until it became a dreadnought, a big monolith. And that trust is carrying on, and it's got a lot of inertia. And it's just going to take time for people to realize, what I'm saying is not really consistent. And I just don't tend to hear answers to this question, well, what about other languages? The mainstream folks will say, if you can get the people who especially have studied at least a little bit of Greek, they'll say, they just need to use the Textus Receptus and the Masoretic text. And as long as they are faithful literal translations of those two perfect texts, then they're fine. The extremists will say, no, they've got to translate the King James or they've got to learn English. And I'm not kidding. They'll actually say that. But if you take the mainstream, which is, my main target here, the people I'm trying to reach out to, this actually goes back to the other question you asked about, the perfect preservation of the Greek and Hebrew texts, because if you look at other languages that did use, quote unquote, the Textus Receptus, and we'll just take one example that I spent some time on in the footnotes of my academic journal article, the Staatenvertaling, which is the 1637 Dutch translation, which is, the equivalent of the King James, but in the Netherlands, it had that same heft. It came around the same time. They also used, in addition to the Textus Receptus, but they used a slightly different one. So if you're going to say, well, we have to stick with the Textus Receptus and every jot and tittle is perfect, and then you say, well, which Textus Receptus? And if you don't get ad hominem back and you can get them to answer that question, well, they'll say, well, whatever textual critical decisions the King James translators made, that's what we need to stick with. And I say, well, then why do you get to baptize English as the norm here? Why not the slightly different, very similar but slightly different ones, the choices that were made by the Dutch translators? And I've never gotten an answer to that.
That's good. Okay, so I've got a question here from Joel. I'm trying to censor these questions because the questions are coming in. But like you said, people are very passionate about this conversation.
I'm sure you've never experienced that before.
This one seems to be reasonable. If the King James Bible isn't God's perfect words, do you correct it with a Bible that's perfect or that has errors?
Quotation marks Bible.
Oh,
so casting
that's right.
aspersions on that.
Bible.
Right.
So speak to us about that. Like, are you claiming that all New Testament, that there is a New Testament Bible, New Testament Bible? That's a stupid thing to say. Is there a Bible that we have access to today that is perfect in an English translation or any other language for that matter? Is there a specific
Do we have a perfect
text or
Bible?
manuscript that's perfect? How do you judge it?
Let me put a question back out there to the ether. You guys don't have to answer this, although you're welcome to.
Yes.
Was Mary immaculately conceived?
I say no. Mary was not immaculately conceived. I'm super Protestant.
Assumed into heaven.
I also say no, very confidently, because I'm Protestant.
I agree with you.
Okay.
Now let me ask you this. Do you have a problem? Would you theologically have a problem with either of those beliefs if the Bible taught them?
No, I would not. There was a donkey that talked once in the Bible.
Right. Yeah.
I believe crazier things.
I could say right now, well, that kind of messes up the doctrine of original sin, but if God wanted to do it that way, then it wouldn't mess up the doctrine of original sin to have her, immaculately conceived. And if Elijah can be bodily assumed into heaven, then Mary can too. I've got zero problems with either of those beliefs. What are my problems with those beliefs? It's the implicit claim to authority that comes along with them. Who is allowed to tell me what happened to Mary and what was the status of her heart, sinful or not, when she was born? Only God has that authority. So does the Bible tell me to expect a perfect translation? No. Does the Bible tell me to expect a perfect version of the Hebrew and Greek that I have access to today? I'm again going to say no, with the asterisk that I have to spend some time defending that, given that Matthew 5:18 could plausibly be read that way. And my major answer again is that, well, if God said that, he didn't give us any other direction about how to find this perfect, set of jots and tittles in the Hebrew and Greek. Now, I have to say something in addition here. You guys are not King James only. I don't have a problem with talking about textual criticism with people who are not King James only, but I actually made a vow 4 years ago to remind myself to not let myself get drawn into talk about textual criticism with King James onlyists. And that's the vow. I won't do it. Why? Because I do not believe that is the issue. When I was 14 and 15, and my pastor, who as best I know, and I haven't been able to ask him since, probably didn't know a lick of Greek himself. Not insulting him, it's just reality. He was telling me, who knew even less Greek, though I did know some Latin at the time, thanks to his own Christian school, he's telling me that the Greek New Testament underlying the modern versions is corrupt. I had nearly zero way of checking this. This is before the internet really hit the big time. I had no idea who Daniel Wallace was.
Y'all's came out.
No idea.
Yeah. Before Y'all's was a thing.
Bible.
The Y'all version wasn't even out yet. Ooh,
yeah.
I just ripped my... there we go.
He's like, now I can't hear your snarky comments. Oh, shoot.
I'm back again. I can hear all the snark.
Okay. So back to your pastor convincing you there's corruption.
I had no means of checking him out. I couldn't read Greek, and most King James onlyists, can't read Greek. Most, people who read the ESV and the NIV can't read Greek either. I'm not saying that's a sin. That's usually the way God has it. Most people can't read the biblical languages. What I'm saying is, though, I accepted a bunch of teaching that I could not check out, and it's really hard for me to acknowledge moral fault there. right? I trusted somebody that I believe I had good reason to trust. So I look out over the landscape of the church and I see this major area of division, people flaming me in the comments right now that I can't see. I'm sure people do this on my YouTube channel on a regular basis. Not everybody does it, but plenty of people do it. I see a lot of division online over this. I've had division with people in real life who've flamed me out in real life. Why is this happening? There's got to be sin, because division and strife and contention are works of the flesh, Galatians 5:19 and to 21 or so say. Are they wrong to believe the wrong thing about the Greek New Testament? Like, that doesn't seem right, because how could they even check it out? I think where the error has come is in King James onlyists' unwillingness to listen to the principle of 1 Corinthians 14. Paul applies this principle to tongue speaking in church, but I believe the principle is stated so many times it's got to apply to translation. I'm not the only one to do this over time. The Reformers did it. Edification requires intelligibility. The King James onlyists themselves have made long lists of archaic words in the King James. And when I say, like, why do I have to say besom instead of broom? Why do I have to say chambering instead of immorality? Like, can I just say the word that I know and that other people know? No, you've got to stick with traditional words because why? Well, because they're based on the perfect manuscripts of the Hebrew and Greek. And I say, well, but we've got other translations based on those same manuscripts. Even if you want to disagree with me about textual criticism, totally fine. Like, I don't think the differences are very big between the Textus Receptus editions out there and the critical text that I use. You're the one who's saying they're massively significant. I don't think they're significant at all, aside from the longer ending of Mark and John 7:53 to 8:11 and 1 John 5:7. And even with those, I don't think that's a big deal. So fine, have your Textus Receptus, but translate it into a version of English that we all speak, because edification requires intelligibility. That's where I try to move every conversation, and I try not to let my King James only brothers kind of move me over into talking about text, because I don't think we need to debate that. And with most of them, I can't anyway. We can't get anywhere because they don't read Greek or Hebrew.
Wow. I was about to ask you about textual criticism, but I won't now.
Thank you.
Now. Yeah, I won't. Okay. All right. So.
No, it's cool. I got a question here for you.
Yeah, go for it.
When it comes to this subject of King James onlyism, or not King James onlyism, just the King James Bible in general, what do we do with it? Are you saying, let's just toss out every King James Bible, Mima, I know you got your King James Bible and it was good enough for John the Baptist, but I need you to get rid of it because it's not doing anyone any favors. Like, what? I know that you said we're going to lose a lot if we get rid of it, but what do you want us to do with it? Do you want us to chunk it all together? Like, never have a King James Bible without, like, a parallel Bible attached to it? Like, what's our answer? What do we do with it?
John McWhorter asked me the same question, and I said, we hold it up to the standard. The standard is edification requires intelligibility. Now, is the King James 100% unintelligible? If so, if that ever happened, then it ought to have the same place as the Vulgate or the Syriac or the early Georgian or Amharic translations in the current evangelical English-speaking Protestant church. It ought to be on the back shelf of scholars somewhere. But we're not there yet, right? The King James is still largely intelligible to literate American adults, the people that I know best. But when you hold it up to that standard, edification requires intelligibility, and you see, there really are these hundreds of dead words, and I've counted 50 or so false friends that we'll talk about, Lord willing, in a little bit, words we don't even know we don't know. That's a problem. And what I've tried to focus on practically, as far as my goal is not getting Mima to throw her King James in the trash. I'm not going to throw my King James in the trash. I use my King James in Logos all the time. I use it in my head because I got tons of King James verses memorized. That's what's still been coming out when I've been talking to you guys. But in institutional contexts, churches, schools, mission boards, camps, VBS, Awana, all of that stuff, the places where adults choose Bible translations for children and teenagers and for adults who are new Christians. I'm saying, if you hold up the King James to the standard of the New Testament, 1 Corinthians 14, then we should not be handing the King James to kids. We should be using translations that use current, contemporary English because edification requires intelligibility. Nobody's on a campaign to throw the Geneva Bible into the trash, or the Bishop's Bible, or Tyndale's New Testament, or going back further, Wycliffe. Because nobody is trying to use those Bibles. The reason I'm pushing back against King James onlyism is that I run into homeless people who their first question to me when they find out I'm a churchy guy is, "Oh, what Bible do you use? Is it the King James?" I want the kids in my Bible club that I spent years investing in, I want them to land in churches for random VBSs that their parents pawn them off on, and I want them to learn verses they can actually understand rather
Amen.
than having words sprinkled in there that means they're just not going to understand the verse overall. This is where I get really passionate. I just really loved those boys that I spent so many years with, and I could never, ever teach them a verse without asking them, what does this mean, and walking it through with them. It seems so pointless to me to have people memorize and use words they can't fully understand.
So baseline is just understanding. I love that. So reminds me my mentor Jack Deere, when I was just kind of starting out in ministry. I remember one time I asked him what Bible translation he recommended, and he said, use the one that says "love your enemies." And his point was his point was probably obvious, but basically, are there differences between the translations? Yes, there are. But at the end of the day, it's that message that gets across, that spans across the different translations. But I do still think that it's worth asking a question that Brandon Hill, and I'll just kind of parrot him here, or rather I'll just quote him. He says, could Mark tell us his top 3 translations he would recommend? So I'll put that out there for you, Mark. What are your top 3 and why?
The most popular article I've ever written for the Logos Bible Software blog, and we're talking, I don't know, tens of thousands of views over the last several years. It actually became a chapter in Authorized the Use and Misuse of the King James Bible. Asked that question, which Bible translation is best? It's actually also now a video on my YouTube channel and my top video. People are interested in this topic. That's why I give those stats. And my answer to which Bible translation is best is all the good ones. I know the evangelical Protestant
It's clear as mud.
I don't know the Catholic space. I don't know the mainline Protestant space. I've used the major modern evangelical English Bible translations, the New King James, the King James. We'll drop that out for a second because it's not modern. The CSB, the NIV, the ESV, the New American Standard Bible, the New Living Translation, and I see room for the Message. I preached an expository sermon from the Message on my YouTube channel just to prove that it could be done. All of the major modern evangelical English Bible translations are good. All the good ones are good. And I say, use whatever one your pastor uses. And then if he uses a more formal one, like the ESV or the NASB, and I say formal instead of literal because I think that's a more helpful term for reasons we could get into and probably in a different interview. If he uses a more formal one, make sure to add to your collection one that's less formal, like the NIV, maybe the CSB or the New Living Translation, and vice versa. Like, I used to feel like, I've got to solve this problem. What is best, formal or functional? And among the formal ones, which are clearly best because all the people I trust say they're best, well, which one is the best? And I just realized over time, we're talking about a collection of 800,000 to 1 million small decisions, some of which are a little bigger, most of which are not. Are we going to say purchased or bought? Are we going to say Lord of Armies or Lord of Hosts? And there's no clear best unless God says, this one is the best. I don't think God would talk that way. Anyway.
I mean, I would be pleasantly surprised.
If God told us which one was best, then we would have to use it, right? But he hasn't told us to expect a best one. He hasn't told us how to produce one. And if I'm going to be involved in Bible study at a deep level, the way I want to be, I'm the editor of Bible Study Magazine, and I'm a pastor, and I'm a father, and I'm a Christian. I want to see all the viable options, and those places of variation among translation actually provide, when there are differences, minor different angles, occasionally more significant, differences of text or of translation, and they're going to lead me toward Bible study gold. So I'm not going to pick a top one. Like, you can hold a gun to my head and I will refuse, because I'm never going to give up any of them. I want them all. They're done by responsible people, and they help me over and over the course of 20 years to understand God's word better.
Now, I want you to weigh in on something that has nothing to, I didn't email you this question. It's out. I'll give you our position on it, but I want to know what you think about the Passion Translation. Before you dive into it, I want to let you off the hook. I know you know that we're charismatic, but we're not that charismatic. Okay, we're putting that one on the shelf, saying no, thank you. That's just our position. But I'd love to know what someone who actually reads Greek and Hebrew and actually knows what they're talking about to weigh in on the subject.
Really briefly, I'm of the Mike Winger school on the Passion
Praise God.
Translation. Yeah. I think, like, I am Mr. Liberal. Don't quote me. Man, I should have said
now
that.
it's on the internet.
But
We'll try to get rid of it.
Mr. All the good ones are good. Liberal in the sense of, open. I'm using all the major translations. And I have no problem with using the Message as long as people understand that it is a paraphrase and not a Bible translation, except at the places where it is a literal rendering. That does happen. Anyway, the Passion Translation, however, takes another step and claims extra revelation from God and speaks irresponsibly about the use of Aramaic. And everybody out there has their own specialty, whether it's you're an engineer for bridges or, you know how to mix asphalt properly for roads, or you're a nurse. And you just know when somebody who claims to be in your field is talking crazy talk. And that is the way that I reacted as soon as I saw the website for the Passion Translation. Now, I say this as a private citizen and not as a representative of Faith Life, because I think we have the Passion Translation, but we have a bunch of stuff in Logos Bible Software, anything that's relevant to Bible study. And I'm not so worried about the pastors and other Bible nerds who use Logos. They know what they're getting when they get the Passion Translation. But I am worried about lay people who think that they're hearing what God really meant as opposed to what the traditional translations obscure. I do think that is a significant problem.
That was super helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mark, I'm thinking back on what you said earlier about the 1 Kings 18 with Elijah on Mount Carmel, and halt ye not between the two opinions, and just quoting it directly and how that stood out to you. And I have to admit, halt ye not does sound pretty dang awesome. And there are just in the King James Bible, there's a lot of stuff that's like that. It sounds so high and lofty. I mean, as soon as you put in a few these and thous, it's already like a more exalted language. And so is there an argument to be made for the fact that, like, hey, this is God's word. Let's lift him up with the sort of language that he would use to communicate revelation about himself, rather than this sort of like lowly dime a dozen Bible translations where you've got a y'all's version and you got all the Passion Translation. Okay, we'll forget about that. But like, is there something to be said for the loftiness of the language?
I think there is something to be said, and where should it be said? In my mind, like, I'm a huge fan of Western classical choral music, and that includes contemporary classical like John Tavener and Arvo Pärt, and I'm a massive groupie for Voces 8, this amazing group of a cappella singers in Britain. I love the King Singers, and during the lockdowns, I used to watch church services from Trinity College, Cambridge. And in that very high and exalted setting, in the beautiful soaring architecture and the liturgical forms that are used there, somehow the King James verbiage kind of fits. And I actually like things that are high and elevated. That's where I sort of naturally tend, like aesthetically speaking. But I think we have to hold up our Bible translations to the norm that God has revealed here. And I do believe that there is one. And it's not in a Bible verse per se. It's in the quality of the Hebrew and Greek as revealed to us. Did God use the form of Greek? And I can speak more knowledgeably about it than I can about biblical Hebrew for a number of reasons. But did God use the elevated and religious, sacrosanct form of Greek, or did he use the vernacular Greek? And the answer is in the name of the kind of Greek that is used in the New Testament. It's called koine, which just means common. Koinonia is having something in common. Koine is common. It's sort of parallel to our word vernacular. Or in the King James translators' words, they translated the Bible so that it could be read even of, and they meant by, even of the very vulgar. That's a false friend, because vulgar to us means somebody who's low and base, but to them, they just meant the common people. That is the level of language. Language comes in sociolinguistic levels. That's the level that God chose. I'm not saying it's all in one narrow band. I tend to think that the poetry of the Old Testament stretches higher, and there are moments in the New Testament where that's true too. Luke, Acts, and Hebrews are more difficult Greek than John and 1 John and Revelation, which are relatively easy. But by and large, when God had a chance to choose what level of language should I use for revealing myself to the nations, he chose the vernacular, the common standard language of the people. And I think that's the language that we should choose in church too.
Amen. So we want to have you kind of circle back around and give your closing thought, the kind of golden nugget. I'm going to toss it over to Michael. Before I do that, I want everyone here to go check out Mark's YouTube channel, Mark Ward. Go search it in the YouTubes, go and subscribe. That channel needs to be way more popular than it is. I think you've got 2,000 plus subs on there. That thing is going to blow up as long as you keep putting faithful content up there, because your stuff is very good, very thorough, and you guys are going to be blessed by it. I know anyone who watches the show, you like listening to Mike Winger, you like listening to James White talking about textual criticism, you like to listen to Doug Wilson. These are guys who've come on the show and talked about these sorts of things. This is a great place for you to continue learning about manuscripts, King James Bible, and those kinds of things. We've oddly enough had a massive group of IFB guys come over in the last, 2 months. I've got a polo chat of like 12 IFB pastors that we're talking to. So if you're here in this space, this would benefit you. Go subscribe to his content, go pick up his book. Really, for sure, stuff that you want to be blessed by. Really, really thorough content out there. Michael, can you give us some closing shots before we wrap everything up?
Absolutely. And Mark, I just want to say thank you for coming on our show. It's such an honor to have you. And I want to honor you specifically for the honorable way. There's a lot of repetition
honor
there.
with an honor.
But the honorable way in which you talked about the other team, which you don't view as really the other team. You view them as brothers and sisters in Christ. And that really comes out when you can say, hey, this argument might have some merit. And hey, there are some wonderful things about the King James Version. When you can talk that way, what it does is it invites people into a conversation. So if I have a closing thought, I think it would be an appeal to those who are viewing, and you do come from the King James only camp. Okay, you might not be convinced from a single YouTube video to start reading an English Standard Version Bible in your prayer times, right? Like, I'm not expecting you to necessarily make that full conversion in a single viewing. But what I would say by way of appeal would be to enter into conversation with people who think differently. Listen, don't put in the ad hominem attacks where you're just calling names, and that's just unacceptable for either of us to do, from us toward you or you toward us, for anybody to do. And so instead of having that kind of monologue where we're just shouting mean things at each other, let's actually have a dialogue about this. Let's, Josh says he has this polo, or Marco Polo, where he has going. It's a little social media app. But the thing is, we want to invite you into a conversation, and we encourage you to find people who think differently, find out why they believe what they believe, and especially credible scholars from other camps. So I think that's really important. That's what we try to do here on Remnant Radio. It's what we always say. We're trying to help people break out of their theological echo chambers, because nobody learns in an echo chamber.
That's right.
So,
Mark, closing thoughts, sir.
I need to make sure to include my key idea, really the one advance that I think I've made, the thing I've added to the conversation, and that is false friends. That's my central concept. Everybody knows there are dead words in the King James, words we know we don't know. Besom, which means broom. Chambering, which means immorality. Emerald, which it should be translated tumor. Long story. Words you come across and you recognize, I'm going to have to look these up. I don't know what this word means. I'm not talking about obscure things. Everybody knows what a broom is. I'm talking about archaic and obsolete words, dead words. Everybody knows those are in the King James. The King James onlyists know they're in the King James. What many people don't realize, but when I name it, they'll say, oh yeah, I really have noticed that sometimes, and now that you have a label for it, that's really helpful for me. there are words they don't know. And how long halt ye between two opinions? That's my classic example, because that's the time when I realized it. I was writing a Bible lesson for 8th graders for BJU Press, where I was a Bible textbook author for a number of years. And I was checking multiple translations because I didn't know what translations the students using the textbook would use. And I checked the ESV, and I'd already memorized this in the King James, and I saw it said, "How long will you go limping between two opinions?" And I thought, that can't be right. So I went back and checked the Hebrew, and the Hebrew says limp, not halt. Because to me, how long halt ye between two opinions means stop. How long you're going to stand stock still between this opinion and that opinion. You know, you're wavering, you're vacillating. But I thought, well, the King James translators, like, they weren't dummies. They knew Hebrew better than I do. So how in the world would they make this mistake? You know, is there a textual variant here? No, there wasn't a textual variant. Same Hebrew underlying text for both the ESV and the King James. So then I searched for halt in the rest of the Bible in the King James, and I saw quickly in the New Testament, Jesus heals the halt and the blind. The halt are the lame or the limping. And it just suddenly clicked with me, duh. That's exactly what the King James translators meant in 1 Kings 18:21 in the early 1600s. And I went and looked it up in the Oxford English Dictionary, which is the only English dictionary. It's a massive 20-volume work. It's continually being revised over the centuries, actually, now, that covers the entire history of the English language. And it will actually tell you the era in which a word was used a certain way. And sure enough, halt, back then, in a context like that one, how long halt ye between two opinions, it meant limp. So it's not my fault, and it's not the King James translator's fault, and it's not contemporary readers' fault for misunderstanding this. It's nobody's fault. It's the fault of language change. And I've discovered at least 50, and there are actually more that I haven't put out on YouTube, false friends. So I have a playlist on YouTube, which is probably my main one for people to watch, 50 false friends in the King James Version. And I just challenge anybody out there, deep lovers of English, deep lovers of the King James Version, I highly doubt that you'll be able to watch my series and not learn something, and probably a lot of something, because it's a reflection of all the stuff that I've learned about what the King James translators actually meant in their English as opposed to how we take it in ours.
Excellent. Mark, thank you so much for coming on. It was an honor to have you here on the program, on Remnant Radio. For those of you who are watching, you've been blessed by this episode or other episodes we've done, and you want to support the ministry, there are links in the description for where you can give. You can give on PayPal or Patreon. If you give on Patreon, you get as low as $5 a month. You jump onto Patreon. We have extra content listed there, along with a book club that we do every week. We read a chapter of the Kingdom of the Cults book, and we go through that book together as a group. That book is going to be over in like 2 or 3 weeks, so I can pretty well stop promoting that. We're going to pick up a new book here pretty soon. If you've got one that you're like, hey, I'd love to read this book with you guys and work our way through it, drop a suggestion in the comments of this video.
All about the conversation.
All about the conversation. We like to talk.
We do.
We'll see you guys tomorrow, 4 p.m. Central Standard Time. We're going to have Father Ron, Matthew Esquivel, and Josh Hoffer discussing the patristics.
Check it out tomorrow.
Specifically, the Pelagius and Augustinian debate. It's
tomorrow,
going to
4
be
p.m. Central Standard
tomorrow.
Time.
Be here tomorrow.
Be here.
I mean, Mark's going to be here. He's going to watch for sure.
For sure.